I'll just do like a little hello to people tuning in. Okay. Sissy will be tech savvy here. Hello, virtual viewers. We're going to be going live. We've had some technical difficulties, so we've tried to improvise, and my laptop will not be used for broadcasting. We're going to use my phone. And so you'll see some of the attendees, and I'll be able to reference any materials and keep it for you guys. But we will start shortly. So Kyle, you can do your stuff, of course.
Thanks, guys, for showing up. Thanks for those who are watching virtually. Looks like we've got a couple. This is, I won't go where everyone see me. This is Gabriella Hoffman. She runs the District of Conservation podcast, and today she's going to talk about if conservation is conservative and what that looks like and how it ties into property rights and other conservative principles. So thank you for joining us, Gabriella. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all for coming on a Friday evening. I know you probably have better things to do, but I appreciate Kyle for inviting me to campus. It's a beautiful day. You guys have had nice weather. I feel like we've been very lucky here on the East Coast to have nice weather. But I will keep my remarks very brief given the technical issues. But conservation, you can kind of associate with environmentalism. I think conservation is a better word to use than environmentalism. Environmentalism has this kind of dirty reputation now with people. So I like using conservation, personally speaking, so you can kind of associate the two terms. And I think it could even also apply to like libertarianism too. It just rolls off the tongue a little better, saying conservation is conservative. So that's what stuck with it. So I hold many titles. Kyle was mentioning my podcast, District of Conservation. I focus a lot on public policy regarding conservation, energy, wildlife, everything you can think of under the sun. And CFACT, who is hosting this event tonight, also sponsors my podcast as well. So I do a lot with CFACT, and really grateful for them to obviously work with you guys and to have me kind of handle this portfolio of issues, because they're kind of neglected, they're kind of misunderstood. And so I've done my best to kind of become an expert, or at least a good listener and observer on these kind of portfolio of issues. And I do a lot of writing at townhall.com. I also have won some awards for my original reporting on certain issues befalling the Western United States as it relates to bear conservation. So I have an award to my name. I'm not just some, uncredible person. I do have some credentials, so I'm not just speaking out of thin air. Some people who criticize my work are like, well, you're just not this. And it's like, no, I actually have an award. I sit on several boards. I'm not, some fringe character. And so, I also do not visiting fellow. I haven't updated this since I got my promotion. I also host several other type of opportunities or work with other organizations like the Independent Women's Forum, where they allow me to explore these topics as well, much like CFAC does. I also work with an outfit called Young Voices, and if any of you want to do communications in the future, Young Voices is a really good opportunity, and maybe I should move out here so people can see, but they can hear me. That's why I brought the microphone. But anyway, so I work kind of in the liberty space all across the board with a chief emphasis on energy, environment, conservation. And I also spend a lot of time outdoors as best as I can. So I think having some familiarity and helps me stand out from some other people who claim to be experts or claim to have some knowledge of what's really happening in the great outdoors. So I try to use my experiences, people I know from different industries who live, eat, and breathe this stuff. Their livelihoods depend on their ability to have conservation practices, their abilities to practice multiple use, develop energy, things of that sort. So I try to be a good listener and someone who pays attention to these issues. And I'm going to chiefly focus on 4 things through my presentation today. Why conservation and conservatism, or libertarianism, if you want to view it that way too, are not at odds with one another. They're actually pretty in sync. I'm also going to talk about what the political left gets wrong about conservation, how they kind of muddle preservation and conservation. I'm also going to explore a little bit what environmentalism, the state of it, looks like right now under this administration. We have a lot of stuff going into an election. Energy is on people's minds. Of course, people are worried about heating oil prices going through the roof. Just north of us in the Northeast, of course, people are very, very concerned. I think all of us who live in natural gas dependent states, I know Indiana is, Virginia is as well. We're very concerned about prices going up. It's impossible to go to a gas station and not find high prices there too. And we're not doing a lot of domestic exploration, unfortunately. There are a lot of pending permits waiting to be approved and leases that have not been opened up deliberately, if you can argue that. I think we can, because they don't want to have that happen much, unfortunately. From what I'm reading into what this administration is doing, they're blaming oil and gas companies, saying they need to produce, but they can't because they haven't been given the authority to produce. They're sitting on a lot of permits, this administration. And I also want to I'll end it with positive takeaways about how conservatives can engage on these issues, especially with respect to environmentalism. Because we can, and I think we are starting to. So coexistence, of course, between the two. Oftentimes, the environmental left will accuse conservatives of being despoilers of the land, hating the environment. You guys have probably heard that often. Also, that we want dirty air, dirty water, because we're all about just developing everything, we're exploiting things, exploiting resources, but I'm here to tell you that is not true in any sense of the way. I think they always like to place these lofty characterizations on Republicans and conservatives that are unfounded, and now I think people are able to refute these characterizations, these mischaracterizations rather, a lot more deftly and a lot more expertly, because we do have the facts on our side, on the center right now. And people are more confident to engage on this issue, so we can say actually those three marks do not define us, and here's why. And so I think even though it's not a direct root word in conservative, there's the root kind of to conserve. You want to conserve good stuff. It doesn't mean you want to be archaic and backwards. You want to conserve good things, and I think it's in our nature to do that as conservatives. Like ever since I was a young girl, my dad always taught me to leave a place better than you found it, to not litter, not to trash. When we're fishing, we can only take what's allowed, what's in season. Now that I do a lot of hunting, I'm very cognizant of what's in season, what type of weapon I can use to go hunting, if I can get a buck or a doe, or if I can get a particular species. So you have to be really conscious about what you can take, how you want to leave the environment better off. And I think for a lot of times people had chastised conservatives and Republicans for not being conservative and conservation-minded kind of equally, but now I'm starting to see a lot of blogs that say, well, actually conservatives are conservationists, and I saw a Sierra Club article that had that tagline. I was like, this is funny. So they dismissed us, and now they say that actually we do have conservationists in our midst, interestingly enough, and it is true, we do. And I've tried to have my lecture be like a quick, easy centerpiece for people to use, and I've noticed people have been using that tagline. Not giving me credit. I wasn't probably the first to coin it, but I've kind of helped revitalize it, I guess, with my platform and such. But I like seeing others with the platform out there to be able to convey that thing, that theme of conservation being conservative. And conservation obviously just means wise use of management, that you're not exploiting resources and having, too much excess of development or too much excess of timbering or whatever. You have it manageable. It's within the means. You're not extirpating species from their carrying capacity or their wildlife surroundings, and you're not causing environmental destruction. I think most people agree we are past that point of over exploiting natural resources. We want a balance, and people want balance, because if you don't have balance, you have a lot of things like wildfires that are going untamed. You have energy shortages, like what I mentioned just not long ago. And so when you don't have balanced use, and I'll explain more what that means, under a conservationist ethos, you get what we have right now. People worried about heating their homes, filling up their gas tanks, and not really confidence in the environment, or actually it's not so much a confidence in the environment. Somewhere I saw that as more prices go up for like energy costs, people get less concerned about, let's say, environmental issues, because when your pocketbook is affected, what time do you have to think about, saving the trees or saving this or what have you? So I think a lot of preservationist environmental policies, which have a lot of overlap with some democratic policies, many democratic policies with respect to environment, they push this extreme view, which I'll explain more what that is, and then they're worried, why don't people care about the environment? It's not like people don't care, it's just certain other issues are going to become more priority minded versus not. So it's there. We have a lot of people in different occupations who are conservatives. I haven't met every single person, but I've met a lot of people who are conservationists, who are politically conservative. Some of them have to be super quiet about it. They can't be open about their views, but they tell me, I am one of you, and it's really nice that there's someone in media, and there are many of us in these different industries, and you have people who hunt, fish professionally or even recreationally who are conservative. You have people who ranch and farm. You have people who work in energy development who are very conservative, but also very mindful of their surroundings. They don't want to see land spoiled. They don't want to see dirty air, dirty water, but they're not saying that to placate themselves from criticism from the left. They actually can show for and say, like, we don't need to be regulated to keep our procedure in check. We can do it on our own. And so we have a lot of people who fit the bill. They're inherently conservation-minded, but they worry about being associated with environmentalists because, like I said, that word has such a dirty stigma. And one unique finding or survey item I like to source is this 2012 survey. There hasn't been one in 10 years, but I hope they issue out a similar comprehensive survey in the future. But it's from the National Wildlife Federation. I've worked with them for a project before. I don't agree with all of their politics. They lean a little too left for my liking, but I worked with them on a nonpartisan project to get more women into the outdoors, and it was a good project. But they had this phenomenal survey, and they talked about where politically hunters and anglers fall. And so 10 years ago, I don't know if this would be a similar kind of result if they were to do this survey again now, 10 years later, but they found that hunters and anglers tend to be Republican and conservative, and they view gun rights just as important as conservation. Proof is in the pudding. They found in this survey that 42% of those who were polled were Republican, 32% were independent, and 18% were Democrats. And then of those Republicans who were polled, 50% said they were conservative, and of that number, 22% said they were very conservative. So the numbers don't lie either. If you need to show your Democrat friends, like, where or what's the ideological breakdown of people who are conservationists, you can cite this source. Like I said, they're not a conservative source. They bill themselves as bipartisan, but they do lean more to the left. But they do have some bipartisan tendencies, and that was something that they put out there for the public. The numbers may slightly change because we have had more people come into hunting and fishing across political lines, but I don't think there's going to be such a huge departure from these 2012 findings. But I like to cite this because it really is a powerful kind of subset of data. Now, how does the left mislead on conservation? Like I was alluding to earlier, environmentalism can kind of be split into two different camps. You have preservation, which is often confused for conservation. Preservation is kind of the status quo. It's this philosophy of we've overdeveloped, we can't have any human impact on the landscape, good or bad. They definitely don't want bad ones, but they're like any even positive human impact is going to be perceived as bad and negative. And oftentimes you have top-down governmental policies that are dictating preservationist thinking. We see this with energy development on federal lands. We see this with the push towards one type of energy source versus other reliable energy sources. You see that they're wanting to do a lot in wildlife conservation to disfavor traditional conservationist hunters and anglers and give more preference to those who scream about wildlife but don't really follow through with pledging money or donating time. A lot of people who kind of virtue signal on conservation. And then true conservation, which is what I tell people to use, or you could say conservation, but true conservation to make the distinction under these two strains of environmentalism. True conservation, it's always kind of been there, but we've had to retake that name and say, well, actually, we're the conservationists. You guys are preservationists. We need to make a clear distinction. And so I would say true conservation is ascendant. And then we obviously like to prize ourselves. We propose whatever the federal government cannot do, it has to have some role. The government does play a role in public lands management. They don't steward the land as properly as they should, in my opinion. But whatever is not in the purview of the federal government to do its basic duty in a limited government fashion, we often welcome free market reforms and private individuals getting involved and kind of having a federalist approach to different solutions where the federal government doesn't have a role or gives leeway to the states and localities to have a role. So conservation can and already is being kind of implemented in policy discussions, and Republicans are now talking about it more comfortably. And so they're saying, like, well, we already do this. We have the solutions. This is our thinking, but we just need to put it into action. And so think of those two terms as kind of the umbrella under environmentalism. So preservation is associated with preserving the environment from harmful human activities. And in my mind, like I said, I was explaining that they don't want much human impact, whether it is bad. I don't think anyone wants bad human impact on the environment anymore. But like I said, they don't even want recreationists to go, in this case, I don't want to bore you guys with kind of semantics or kind of details of a topic you may not be familiar with, but I've noticed in public lands access, a lot of times they promise public lands access, but it's actually keeping people off public lands when you add certain restrictions on there. Nothing for you guys really to know, but if you want more research into it, I could explain it. But preservation largely keeps the public, in many cases, off public lands. That's what I've examined with certain examination into certain public land designations. We see now with a rule that was handed down by the Department of Interior to ban lead, tackle, and ammunition. So that is often seen as an attack on your ability to go outdoors if you're going to be priced out of the activity, therefore being an infringement on your ability to access public lands. So it's often defined by alarmism, very anti-capitalist attitudes, selective exploration of energy. There's a preference, as you guys probably have observed, of going towards solar and wind, which have unfortunately been proven to be unreliable, and we can't fully replace the existing grid with just those two. They don't really talk about nuclear as much. They definitely hate fossil fuels, and domestic mining, which is needed to power so-called clean energy. They don't want to open any new mines. So they're kind of tussling and wrestling with this grand idea, but they don't want to take the steps to get there. For permitting reform, they don't want to develop new mines that could accommodate and kind of help meet the demand for all the materials required of whether it's electric vehicles or minerals. They don't want to do that. And then they often like to demonize individuals and companies, and they say, well, these companies are engaged in exploitative activities, like what we're seeing with President Biden calling out oil and gas companies for not pumping and not offering supplies. And so they get blamed, and then it's actually government that's at fault here. And a final thing that they like to do is put us into global non-binding agreements, which are mere virtual signaling channels, and we don't have the ability to get ourselves out of it, even though it's not congressionally authorized in many cases. So like the Paris Accords or some of the other agreements they have put us into. And being in a global agreement or like a Paris Accord doesn't really motivate other countries to lower their emissions. It's often just a select few. I think most recently, some of these climate activists were really upset that only 26 countries that signed on to the COP26 agreement to reduce their emissions and reduce their ecological footprint, only 26 or 23 of like 190 something different countries said they are on track to meet those standards. So it's kind of unreliable, it's kind of a unrealistic expectation. So that's kind of the metrics that you see through preservation. Very government heavy-handed, shrugging off individuals. Conservation, of course, is the responsible use of natural resources. It's defined by individual input, private interests, and kind of working with the states and the Fed when appropriate and when needed. It's often defined by balanced use, where you can have on public lands multiple uses. You can recreate on, let's say, forest lands, and also be able to do timber or cattle grazing, something of that nature. It's also known as multiple use sustained yield management of public lands. This also does occur sometimes on private land as well. There's also a great phenomenon that happens called stakeholder cooperation, where you get private interests, public interests, state, local, federal, what have you, private, public sector, and they work together. And we saw a lot of this happening under the last administration. It was really actually exciting to see voices that felt powerless have a seat at the table, being actually heard by the federal government. Now, a lot of people are very worried that kind of balance that was achieved has been eroded. They're only listening to a few select stakeholders, really kind of environmental extremists that they're listening to, like the Sierra Clubs and all. So we had a great kind of system in place in the last administration, but now a lot of people are very distrustful of the current one. So as I was alluding to, a lot of people like to say, I'm such a conservationist, these conservatives are not, they're terrible, they're despoilers of the environment. But you look at the number, knowing that most people who identify as hunters and anglers tend to incline themselves to Republican politics or conservatism, an overwhelming number, and independents follow pretty closely afterwards. You can see by the funding for conservation, when it's broken down, the chief, I would say the majority of it, like 80%, 60 to 80% of it, is drawn from excise taxes collected on firearms, guns, licenses, largely from hunters and anglers. And I'll explain what that law is. But this last year alone, it was $1.5 billion generated back to habitat restoration efforts, wildlife conservation efforts, public shooting ranges, and hunters education courses. So a lot of money has been going back to conservation because of the contributions of hunters, anglers, and other similar conservationists, and then also private contributions too. And I'll talk more about the Pittman-Robertson Act momentarily. People are really befuddled when they hear the connection between conservation funding and firearms purchases. And they're like, how can that be? What is the mechanism in place? So a law that was put into effect called the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act of 1937, better known as the Pittman-Robertson Act, a very off-sided bill in our industry. This bill was passed after kind of decades of market game hunting, a lot of commonly known species now that are rehabilitated and kind of been brought back. A lot of popular species like deer, elk, turkey, black bear were almost eliminated because we didn't have a system in place to kind of put a check on, like seasons and limits and all that kind of stuff. So this law was encouraged by hunters, by anglers, by trappers, by others who are creating outdoors. They make a livelihood. They made a livelihood off of it, or they were just very interested in seeing that continuation of the ability to go fishing, go hunting, to enjoy the outdoors. So this law, probably one of the few accomplishments of FDR that I like. The only good thing I think that he did, one of the few things, positive things he did, was sign this into law. And this bill has kind of helped, like I said, fix a lot of the problems with wildlife conservation efforts. It's brought back a lot of species that we see frequently, and even with like development, like I was telling Kyle earlier, I saw, I think, a red-tailed hawk fly over the university, and I saw this big, like a fox squirrel and like chipmunks. You guys have a lot of wildlife even on campus, which is amazing. So even with development, sometimes animals are very highly adaptable in one case, but that's an aside. But this law has been very instrumental in conservation funding from people who tend to lean conservative and go fishing and hunting, drawing that connection back there. So the revenue from excise taxes is collected by the Department of Interior. Then they're allocated through this fund called the Wildlife Restoration Fund, and on the fishing side, it's called the Sport Fish Restoration Fund through the Fish and Wildlife Service. I know that may be complicated, but that's the one agency within Department of Interior that does this. And then they're apportioned, the funds, to each state, every 50 states, or rather, every state of the 50 states is apportioned an amount, a very different amount, according to different metrics. Land area, hunting, and licenses, and fishing licenses sold. So it's apportioned according to all those three areas. So I think probably California probably gets a big chunk of that money, even though they have fewer hunting participants and fishing participants. I bet Texas probably, actually, I think maybe Texas may have the most money because they have over 1 million registered, or licensed hunters rather. So Indiana, if you want to check like how many percentage-wise or amount-wise, like how much Indiana got in this last year, I think it's a pretty sizable number. You guys have a lot of deer hunters here. But it's a really interesting, method, excuse me. And excise taxes, I am the most, I would say one of the most limited government people, and it's not like a concession or anything saying like, I support like taxation. Taxation in many cases is theft. But the excise tax for Pittman-Robertson is designed a little differently. And obviously an excise tax is a tax imposed on a specific good or activity. With respect to revolvers and pistols, there's a 10% tax, and then there's an 11% tax imposed on ammunition and other firearms, and then archery is at 11%. And there's actually been a debate among Republicans. I've actually had to chew out some Republicans, fellow conservatives, who said that Pittman-Robertson was an infringement on Second Amendment rights, and there has been, in my view, no evidence of that. You may hold different opinions, but I've looked into this to see like why would the firearms industry support Pittman Robertson? And they do. And I was asking my contacts there, I was like, well, why are people saying it's an infringement? They're like, well, they're saying it because, like, personally, someone's an FFL, so they have some misplaced givings and all that. But when it's, I would say, understood properly, and improvements to the law can be made, absolutely. I think there's now going to be more funding to public shooting ranges, and that's where we can see those dollars go to more effect. But the Tax Foundation, which is a pretty good authority on taxes, said it was an excellent excess tax, how this system is put into effect. And I was trying to research, I forget what was it was the Rand Corporation. So they definitely don't lean conservative, but they were doing a study on whether or not imposing excess taxes infringes on rights, and they couldn't come to a conclusion. So it was interesting to see that as well. But we've had a debate over excess taxes, Pittman Robertson, on the center right, unfortunately, recently. And I've had to respectfully disagree with some people because I don't see it as an infringement. I am fine with excise taxes going to this because these are public resources. Anytime you fish for stock trout or hunt deer, what have you, that is from us, and we're seeing those monies largely stewarded okay compared to, let's say, income tax and other type of taxes, which do have negative externalities. But this excise tax, I think, is designed where even though there is a certain percentage that is levied, you're not seeing it on your price tag. And it has, even if you were to take away the excise tax, you won't see it have much of an effect on your price of guns and ammunition. You don't see it in the price tag. But that's a recent debate, and I may update the presentation to reflect that. But the Tax Foundation had a really good explainer on why they think that's the best way to do excise taxes, not on alcohol or tobacco, the way how they did that before. Some examples of conservatives advancing kind of a true conservationist policy. These aren't totally perfect, but I want to cite some examples. So several agencies which oversee, let's say, natural resources or public lands. The best one, for example, that I think most people like is the National Park Service. And they have some shortcomings like anything in government, of course, but I think most people like the national parks. They like going to Yellowstone, Grand Canyon, what have you. That was started under Theodore Roosevelt. The EPA, I think we have hate-love relationships with the EPA. Depends on who's in office. But when Republicans are in office, generally speaking, the EPA works according to plan. It doesn't engage in suspicious behavior or really kind of exceeds its bounds. We're now seeing that return, kind of like what we saw under Obama, now back at the EPA in a sense. But Nixon started the EPA, interestingly enough. So Republicans actually did have a hand in some of these agencies, for better or worse. And even when we left the Paris Accords under the Trump administration, we were cutting emissions like no tomorrow. I think there was a demonstrable decrease without having to impose more taxes on people, no carbon tax, not getting rid of fossil fuels. So we were still the world's leader in emissions reductions without having to be part of a global pact. And then also under the Nixon administration, we saw the passage of the Endangered Species Act. Under Trump, we saw the Modern Fish Act, which is a great bill that kind of makes it so the federal government does not regulate commercial and recreational fishing in the same way. The Great American Outdoors Act is one of the most talked about bill, but Trump got it in. Interestingly enough, passed it, or signed it into law rather. There was one to expand outdoor opportunities for veterans, and then there was the America's Conservation Enhancement Act, and then Trump did sign into law a target shooting range bill that also ties into Pittman Robertson. It was a good bill, and there's a bill now to kind of enhance access even further, so Pittman Robertson dollars actually do go more to your shooting sports activity. So people who are kind of flimsy about Pittman Robertson can be assured that there are measures being taken to actually see those dollars go more towards your shooting activities. And there was the largest expansion of public lands under President Trump. It's like 2.3 million acres, and they've tried to contest that now under this administration, and there's a whole lawsuit, which I don't have to go into, but he did expand public lands a lot, and we've seen a lot of loss of actually public lands access to hunting and fishing under this administration, with closures in Alaska and a few other places and measures that are being considered. So a lot of interesting things have happened under Republicans in recent memory and in the past. So what does conservation kind of look like under the Biden administration? I'd say we're creeping, and we're already in preservationist territory. On his first few days in office, he put into executive action, undoing everything, a lot of the reforms that helped kind of achieve a balance between energy and the economy. And we have seen a shift to, obviously, no more independence for energy exploration. We're not having to depend on others, and we're sitting on so many untapped reserves, billions and millions of different types, and they don't want to drill and they don't want to develop. We have seen different people, actually, Gina McCarthy, I think, is soon to leave. I think there was a report that she was expected to leave soon. I've even seen chatter of John Kerry now potentially leaving, but John Kerry used to be Secretary of State. You guys probably are familiar, but Gina McCarthy used to be EPA director for some time under Trump, or not Trump, sorry, Obama. And John Kerry was Secretary of State, and he's really big into climate stuff. And he's, I forget, the climate envoy. It's a special like ambassadorial role. And I think I saw somewhere he may be leaving after this COP26 conference in Egypt. That's what I've heard. Secretary of Interior Haaland, certainly a historic figure, and the Native perspective has certainly been brought about to the forefront. However, she was an original co-sponsor of the Green New Deal, and a lot of people have been very mixed about her performance in the conservation space. And several other people in the EPA and Energy Department have also kind of had very questionable positions. Secretary Granholm has laughed off at high gas prices, and she's kind of a cringe-worthy figure. So everyone is kind of in line with this preservationist thinking that we're seeing in this administration. Conservatives have filed lawsuits. Obviously, after the Keystone Pipeline cancellation, you're going to see more lawsuits challenging the lack of exploration of different onshore and offshore leases. You're also going to see even intra-party or kind of intra-fighting among environmentalists of the left. I've seen it in two examples where onshore, like domestically, not in the ocean where they're looking to do offshore wind, bird activists and big wind or solar have kind of hit and butt heads over, imperiled condors, and then are they going to be jeopardized because of the construction of wind turbines, very tall wind turbines. And then also there's an issue even among different environmentalists, like should we rely on China for minerals, or are we going to develop here for solar panels? And then same with electric vehicles, there's a lot of butting heads among even those on the left in the environmental space about how do we advance this and still be, America first or what have you. And so they're running into issues even among their own coalition. So I think their policies are kind of falling on their head there. And so obviously kind of a quick roundup of the bad stuff that's been going on. There's a lot of bad things unfortunately happening now. But a moratorium on new oil and gas leases onshore, on federal land and offshore. They're definitely preferring offshore wind, which is questionable to say the least. And if you actually discourage oil and gas development, there's a program called the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is funded by offshore gas and oil royalties. And if you don't drill, that fund will not be replenished. So that's something they haven't fully taken into account. And there's also our re-entry into the Paris Accords, but again, our involvement does not propel others across the globe to lower their emissions. It's more so for us to kind of exhaust our means and not really, I would say, adhere to like a true conservationist ethos. And some more, I would say, interesting policies that are afoot. Abandoning energy independence, obviously, he was begging OPEC. OPEC said, no, you gotta find it for yourself. And they're trying now to go to Venezuela and other countries for oil when we can do it here. And then there's also an initiative called 30 by 30, which would, if it goes into effect, they claim it's going to protect 30% of waters and lands by 2030. But it's a very dubious plan because most of the West is already exceeding that 30% mark. Some states have 40%, 60% public lands, 80% Nevada. I think Nevada is close to 80, 90% in federal land holding. The feds control most public lands there. And so most states already meet that threshold, so people are like, well, if we're already meeting this threshold, we really don't need to do this. So it's a way, again, it's kind of counterintuitive. They say we want to protect it, but they'll essentially make it harder for people to recreate. And I've seen this example in California where they had a Marine Life Protection Act area, and they said, well, we have to close off this area to recreational fishing because the sea life is in peril, they're in a very bad situation, and we have to keep anglers away from this so they can be rehabilitated. When they were pressed upon, what is the impact from those protection areas? They said, well, we haven't really had much of improvements, so we need to keep these there. And then apparently in a study that I read, the fishing industry discovered that there was actually no crisis, where it was a really small matter that could have been fixed without having to create no-go zones in Southern California. And so I see that as a mirroring of what that was. That was an extreme case in California, but I worry they can say we will protect this for the public, but then you lose your access to it, whether for fishing or hunting onshore or fishing offshore. And so that's something you may hear very soon more about 33, because there's the Montreal conference that's happening about that issue. They've also done a lot to kind of misinform about national monuments, and they've designated a lot of wilderness areas. And those designations on the surface are really good, and they can have some usefulness, but national monuments have been weaponized largely to move certain public lands like Bureau of Land Management lands, Forest Service lands, away from the multiple use model, put more protections under them, under the guise of protecting them, and then make those lands national parks. And that's not how national parks should be created in those cases. So they've kind of abused those designations, and there's debate over should we shrink the president's authority on this. So there's probably going to be congressional debates on what powers does the president have to designate or to shrink monuments coming up, because it's a law from 1906 and it's overdue for some modernization. So a lot of people are worried that the federal government can create restrictions even under the guise of expanding public lands access, and that's something we have to wrestle with. So where can conservatives win on these issues? I think tying energy independence to national security is one. I think a lot of people, we look to our European friends, and they are now having to scramble to find reliable energy sources, because most of them have moved away from relying on fossil fuels, and they're going to have to go abroad. We could have helped them fill the void, but we're not producing here much. We're sitting on a lot of reserves. So from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that's kind of where that worry came from. Now you see countries in Europe, especially, moving back to coal and fossil fuels after fully embracing solar and wind, and to their detriment. I think that's what they're recognizing, that they didn't have to go fully on board with that. We can also advocate for market-based or limited government solutions, and we can decouple climate from issues, because if we make everything about climate, I think it dilutes people's interest, because people hear climate and they associate catastrophe. Oh my gosh, I don't want to have any part of this. And what I've understood and what I've been able to communicate to others is when you decouple that issue more and talk about climate in its rightful place, not in every environmental issue, because some issues don't necessarily have an environmental hook on it. You get people interested in this issue more, and they're not going to be turned off by the alarmism often associated with everything being about climate. And we have to pursue, obviously, in all of the above, but I think we can still lean on the affordable, cheap fossil fuels that have made us live really good lives here in the United States. Natural gas is really good. It's even better sometimes than fossil fuels. And of course, we were talking earlier before the broadcast that nuclear is the true carbon-free or carbon-neutral source that I think most people, even in the fossil fuel industry, would like to see. That could be our future, but we have a lot of roadblocks, a lot of opposition. But if that's fully realized, nuclear is the true clean energy source compared to solar and wind. It doesn't require that much land. When monitored very safely, it can really take off well and not cause as much harm as people believe it will. And it's not intermittent. It's not reliant on the wind or the sun. It can run 24 hours and has a really good, reliable base load. And then obviously we have to point out the hypocrisy and high costs that come with transitioning away from fossil fuels. Now we see this with a lot of people flirting with that. So I think we can win on these issues. I think we're starting to win. Two books I want to recommend to you before I open it up to Q&A. The Blue Mind by a marine biologist is a book that I really took to heart, and it was about how your body and mind are at ease whenever you're by water. So whether you're jet skiing, fishing, at the beach, river, lake, what have you, when you're around water or some semblance of water, it's better for your psyche, it's better for your overall health. And he was even cautioning environmentalists. He said a quote that people won't respond positively when we bore the heck out of them with a lot of facts. They won't respond with action when we make them feel guilty or bad about themselves. Yet that's exactly what the environmental movement is doing, scaring people, making them feel bad, and overloading with data. So when you hear an indictment of that, the environmental movement, from a very reputable source like Wallace J. Nichols of the Blue Mind, that says a lot. And then you guys have probably heard of Michael Schellenberger, who authored Apocalypse Never, and he has kind of rejected his former self. He called himself a climate alarmist, and he regrets peddling kind of that school of thought, and he's really come about and come against rather kind of this alarmism associated with a lot of environmental politics. He's a big nuclear guy. He's probably the biggest nuclear guy as a public figure, and he comes to the defense of conventional energy sources too, and kind of exposes the hypocrisy of some of his former colleagues or compatriots. And he's not a conservative. He's kind of a center-left guy, and it's really fascinating to kind of see his thinking take off and more people read him and understand where he comes from. And he's been embraced by many on the right, and he does a lot on homelessness and all, but he's probably one of the go-tos, I think, leading authority, having worked in the green movement and been a thought leader, getting all these awards. He's a trusted person. He's not a crank by any means, but even he was able to recognize that some of the stuff he was touting, a lot of the alarmist stuff, was not fruitful and productive. And so the takeaway, obviously, I think some conservatives fall into the trap of repeating leftist talking points. I encourage you not to do that, and I can help you if you're interested. Being action-oriented, joining true conservation groups, following free market environmental organizations like CFACT and others out there, and then telling your own story relating to conservation and environment. I think that's what helps people kind of understand your perspective, and someone can't say, well, that's not your truth, but you could say, well, actually, this is my truth. I've lived this. This is my lived experience with conservation and environment. So we can, I think, respond that way. And if you're interested in opportunities, let's say my remarks were somewhat interesting, or you kind of like these topics, you want to get more involved, CFACT has a Dreams and Fellowship, which Kyle can talk to you about. And then there's the Young Voices Contributor Program, of which I'm a regional leader. And I don't handle Indiana, but I can connect you to my colleague if you want to do more media writing, media placement. It's perfect for those between the ages of 18 and 35. So opportunities, I like to come with opportunities. I have social media. Kyle can give you all my info. And that's pretty much it. So we can talk about Q&A if you guys are interested. And I can do this, move around now. Q&A. So does anyone have a question? You can pick my brain about anything. Yes, go ahead, Kyle.
Okay. I think one of the questions that comes up when you talk about the follies of the alarmist climate agenda is that people don't really care about the climate when they can't heat their homes, when they can't put food on the table,
Mm-hmm.
Especially not just in a domestic light, but speaking globally and speaking about people in these very poor third world countries that are being
Mm-hmm.
told by globalist elites that they need to practice sustainability when they're just trying to feed
Mm-hmm.
their populations.
Mm-hmm.
What's the conservative response to that?
We do have to partly go on defense for that, but I think we could do it tenderly and carefully. But we could say, well, we can't come about it from a neo-colonialist perspective and impose our values on these people. Not saying that we can't influence them positively to say, like, well, you should learn how to power your homes. There are the resources to do it. But I think a lot of people in the preservationist environmentalist movement have a tendency to be lecturing and kind of chiding against these people from enjoying cheap, practical energy sources. And I think we just have to say, well, every country is different. We can't impose on them your will. I know they do this in India, they do this in Africa, they do this all over the place. And they tell them, well, you have to automatically transition to solar and wind. It's like most of them don't have basic heating and fuel at this current point in time. And so for us to say, like, you have to do this when they haven't yet experienced the luxuries that come with fossil fuels or oil, gas, and anything else like that, I think we could say, let's encourage them to go at their means, and they'll get there. They'll learn how to steward their land. They're going to learn not to waste energy. They're not going to do things. So I think we shouldn't be judgy of different cultures. I think that's and not be neo-colonialist. Yes.
I think just to add to that point, I think the West really needs to even educate themselves of the cultural differences. When we talk of China and India,
Mm-hmm.
look at the population size, yet the emissions are way less than what US is contributing to the world, with barely not even 3% of the total population of both countries together. So I think for me, especially the Paris Accord or something, that's like a sham.
Redistribution is sham, yeah.
Right, it's just a sham wherein, and I'm glad countries like China and India are taking a stand, just for the sake of development. They're not even, the data is there. They can actually, throw it at the West, saying, here's the data for what you are contributing versus what we are contributing per person based on the population. So, yeah.
Interesting. Anyone else have a question? Yes, sir.
It's a question with a bit of a comment. When I was a young lad, with a BS in sociology, very interested in political and mass movements, and also strangely very interested in nuclear power and nuclear energy as a kid, actually. So I became very interested in the anti-nuclear power movement. And I decided to do some research, write a book. So I did a huge amount of research back in the late 70s, all about energy and what have you. And it is my view that the anti-nuclear movement was incredibly damaging. It was adopted by the Democratic Party in its 1980 platform. It said, we got to get rid of nuclear power. And I have opined in print, no longer available, that really Democrats are responsible for global warming. Because if you look at the development of nuclear power, initially the federal government and the Atoms for Peace program, they were doing all this stuff to develop peaceful nuclear power. There were a whole lot of different programs. And somewhere in there it started turning into a regulator. And it basically regulated it out of existence. And so for all of those years, when we could have gone the direction of France and maybe gotten 85 or 90% of our electrical power from nuclear, it never happened. And it puts us in this situation. And the other thing was, I was studying all this stuff during the transition from everybody was concerned about an ice age. And they were talking about things like a snow blitz and this and that. And it was over maybe a 2 or 3 year period that began to switch. The point that is of concern to me is you mentioned nuclear, you mentioned some of these other things. And I thought it was very good too that you mentioned the extent to which the preservationists prevent even development of this so-called renewable.
Right. Very much.
And to me, the issue is the government shouldn't be in it at all. So here
We gotta
comes
relax
my
it more.
question.
Yeah.
I wanted you to know that I
Sure.
actually have studied this pretty extensively.
Sounds like you
So
have, yeah.
Here's my question. Why should there be any federal lands? Why should there be any federal lands at all? How much of it, why can't we turn it over to the states or sell it?
Well,
Why don't we sell Yellowstone and all these other things? Sell it to Six Flags. Let them run it. I bet they'd do a better job. I've talked to conservatives about this. And
I'm gonna
they
have to
get
disagree with you there.
horrified. I figured you would.
And it's okay. We can have this robust debate. I just think places like Yellowstone, they do carry a special place. Like, I have fond memories of going there, and I think people could see wildlife. We have people who are reckless and don't know how to handle wildlife. Those are exceptions to the rule. But I think compared to, let's say, the rest of the world, like most of Europe is largely private, and it may work for them. And I like private property, hunting on private lands and all that. And I think you could I think sometimes private lands are stewarded better in many cases. But I think if we abolish federal lands, I think that, I don't know if companies would do a better job with managing it. And I think,
There's research on that.
but it's not a popular idea. I don't want to deflect on your question, but I think a lot of people value having, like out west, most hunters will hunt out west. And if you tell them the idea of turning it away to the states or to private land interests, you will not get positive reception. And I worry, playing devil's advocate, let's say you were to transfer public lands, let's say into state or private interests. I worry that, let's say if it becomes privatized fully, you have nonprofits who do not have conservationist interests in mind buying up all that land and to keep activities off of it. No balanced use. And the public model allows you to have different stakeholders on the land, recreating or commercially profiting. And then I also worry that adversaries like China could come in with, best offers, procure all the land like what they're doing now, private land, and then just even make things more dubious with respect to that. So I think people can exploit the privatization of land to keep people off of it and to keep multiple uses off of it too. So that's partly why I'm opposed to it, and I just still think public land does have a value. It can be managed better, but I don't think I don't think it's practical, in my personal opinion, to have a wholesale transfer. Maybe states like Utah can debate whether or not to do it, but I don't personally support transferring all federal lands back to the states.
It has to be a perfect balance wherein, both are in check, the state
Yeah.
and federal.
Absolutely.
I
federal-
don't see any preservation taking place if it just goes to states, or less of that.
Yeah. I think we haven't really had that conversation because I think, especially under COVID, people have gone to recreate on national parks. I've seen a lot of people maybe have a newfound appreciation for the outdoors, so I don't want that to be lost. And it is very difficult. Let's say you want to hunt or fish on private lands. You don't know the landowner. It's going to be very hard to access. You're going to have to pay these exorbitant fees. Not that it's impossible to access private land. I primarily hunt on private land because I know some landowners or I belong to some different clubs and you buy a membership. But public land out west is a very cherished thing because it's a very different type of hunting style and fishing style too. It's unlike anything else. It's very accessible to the public. They manage it largely okay for those activities. And like I said, you'll have ranching, grazing, and these other very vital industries still be able to do that if the Biden administration doesn't ruin this kind of traditional thinking. But I don't think you're going to see much of a popularity, maybe except for Utah or some people from Texas supporting that. I think even Republicans have said no. I don't think there's really much we should do there. And I tend to agree with that. I think you could, like I said, I think you could better steward and you can have some federalism where if there's unclear areas about public lands management, as often the case happens in a state like Alaska, the Trump administration put in a rule that said anything relating to hunting regulations that were unclear about, it's going to go back to Alaska and the states. So you can have some federalism even among federal management, and I think we could, like I said, just better input, but I don't see anyone supporting that, and I think you're going to get a lot of blowback from Western hunters and anglers who are conservative and say, like, we will not support the Republican Party if that ever happens. So I don't think it's a popular idea, and I don't personally support it. But I know it's a conversation.
I'm not surprised, but what I've found is that there seems to be an exception with respect to things like national parks.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of reminds me of a discussion I had with a person about funding for the arts.
Mm-hmm.
I'm an art snob,
Mm-hmm.
and I love classical music and so forth, but it can't really support itself, and so you get government funding.
Mm.
And the people who end up paying for this are the fry cooks and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And it has an effect on them, whereas people like me, well, we could actually afford to fund it. And so I see lots and lots of exceptions for government involvement in things where I, as a very hardcore small government person,
Because I think,
I see carving out exceptions for the things that people like, and then you run into the problem where it becomes a political football, and you can have it become a political issue where the Biden administration or some other administration some preservationist or
Mhm.
environmental radical group, they can use those levers of power,
Mhm.
and now we're fighting over it.
Yeah.
So that's the other aspect
Yeah, see, I
that
want
comes
to,
into play.
it's not because I think, I trust government, but I think in the limited areas where they're supposed to have influence, in the small scope of things, I think when we have the right people in charge, they will let individuals and states and others, even under their framework, have more of an input, and they're not going to encroach on your ability to, like I said, to graze or to ranch or to farm or to go fishing and hunting. And that model has largely worked in place, with the exception of whenever we've had far left presidents in office. I just think it's too delicate of an issue, and it's not a battle you want to ignite with people who may fall in your coalition. Like I said, a lot of Western people who tend to vote Republican would say, nope, we're going to never vote Republican or Libertarian again, in that regards, because people see, like I said, with it being a public resource, it's one of the few things, if any, that government can do well when we have good people
So,
stewarding it.
I don't want to monopolize.
No, it's okay.
But when I look at government regulation, I mentioned nuclear power. Government killed it, functionally killed nuclear
Mhm.
power. NASA was a disaster. No progress for 30, 40 years. Government bureaucracies become self-serving. This is public choice economics 101. They become self-serving, and they no longer function to perform that original function that they were created to do. They function to preserve themselves. So you're saying there's an exception here, and I'm extremely skeptical of that. The stuff that I've read about
I just don't want to see
management-
Coca-Cola signs on a national park. I think a lot of people,
Well,
it's kind of cheap, and it defeats, like, people want to see wild places because they don't see wild places in many
that's
parts of the world. So people
that-
come here and
Yes.
appreciate that we can still, like, we have,
it's a fair point.
like,
I
we,
understand.
yeah,
I
and-
understand what you're saying. I'm just suggesting that, for example, the problem with wildfires, species management, there's a whole bunch of information on this. I'm not as interested in it, but I've read about it enough that I'm skeptical that government is a better steward than private interests.
there are some private interests trying to help. There's a outfit called the Blue Forest Conservation, and they're offering bonds, resilience bonds. So they work in concert with the government because they see that government stall. So it's not like there won't be any private things for issues like that. But wholesale transfer of public lands is not something a lot of people, in my opinion, would support.
I think you're right.
But you can have, with respect to, like I said, stewarding public lands, getting more private people involved to make sure government does not curb your ability to access public lands or to make a livelihood off of public lands. That's where I think private interest should come in, not gobble up, not buy sponsorship
Yeah,
of.
you don't want Six Flags to run.
No,
Yellowstone.
no, I don't. It's already crowded as it is, but I think it's okay to have this conversation, and I understand, and I would, in an ideal world, that would be great, but I think in this little area, I just see it where it's not like a failure of markets to have an impact here. I just think in the small confines of what government is supposed to do, like for life, liberty, etc., I just think this is one area where we want to be able to have access. And then we'll just finish off with one more question.
Yeah, I think just to add, like, your question, why should we have any federal land? Like, it will only hold validity when there is data to prove that federal, they've not been doing the job they're supposed to do, or most of the job. So, if we see degradation of these very places, that is when probably, that this will become a more valid question.
Mining. We can't make photovoltaics in the United States with our own material because we can't mine it. All federal lands, it's almost impossible now to do the kind of exploration we need to do. I mean, there's a practical reason for selling a lot of this stuff off so that the feds couldn't make it impossible to do. And yet, they're pushing photovoltaics, and we have to buy them from other people for that reason.
For
So-
that, a public-private partnership can also
Yeah.
work. So I think that itself
Maybe.
can suffice, that can solve the problem that you're trying to mention. And
Well, they
again,
also
we should
wanna
not
stop
extrapolate
private.
exceptions as part of the bigger thing,
Yeah.
because, you know, I would myself, if this was happening, like, I would myself ask the same question. But I think to come to that stage, I think there needs to be more data or problems that we can cite, that we would say, oh, private ownership or
Yeah.
state should gobble up this.
I think you're right. This is an area that really needs a lot of research. We need to really look into that.
But it's a valid question to ask, but I think we're not there yet to.
Yes, yes.
Mhm.
Old guy should have.
No, this is
And-
free speech, all perspectives welcome. And no, we welcome debate on our side, of course. I know the merits and arguments of that question, and we may see that conversation happen again in the future, but that's kind of where I stand personally. But I think that's it for this, and for those of you tuning in virtually, thank you guys for watching, and thank you guys for having me.
Thank you.
I will-
very much.
Okay. Fabulous.